And again, I want to thank everyone for being with us today, no matter how you're with us, on the bridge, on the video stream, or perhaps even watching at some later time on the recording. There's no time or space in the mind of God. And I do believe that the ideas that we discuss are timeless. So welcome, everyone. Last week, I want to back up just a second and touch a little bit on last week, when in anticipation of our month of Thanksgiving and our month of gratitude, I talked about opening ourselves up, excuse me, that many times we wish to have a different experience in life, a better experience in life, and we don't really want to let go of anything that we already have. We want to continue to drag it all around with us. And while our spiritual growth is inevitable, it is the destiny of each and every soul that the divine has created to one day awaken to its spiritual nature, to one day awaken to its unity with the divine. We can certainly help that process along through our conscious cooperation. It requires us to consciously cooperate. The divine cannot force itself upon us. It has created us out of itself, and it has allowed us to make that discovery all by ourselves. Certainly with the help and the inspiration and the guidance of those in our lives, our teachers, the books we read, the tapes we listen to, but mostly the callings of our own heart, the awakening of our own heart. And what we want to consider is that the things that we hold on to, the things that we don't want to let go to, they're kind of like a crust, that within us is the magnificence, within us is the presence, within us is what Jesus called the secret place, the kingdom. The kingdom is within. And what we are trying to do as we awaken is we are trying to experience more and more of that in a very tangible way, a very real way, a very real presence to us. As Dr. Holmes said, a friend that is with us, something that is real and tangible. But we have kind of this barrier or this crust of things that we want to hold on to. And that's why last week we talked about one of the ways to kind of prepare ourselves to receive is to empty ourselves out of the things that we no longer want in our lives, that we no longer need in our lives, that no longer serve us. And one of the greatest things that we can empty ourselves out of is resentment. And that's what forgiveness is all about. Now, having said that, our goal, if we want to call it a goal, I don't think goal is exactly the right word because that sounds like something that we strive for. But the end point, as far as we know it now, keep in mind that the end point is like a horizon. As you move towards it, you discover another horizon beyond it. But as we kind of understand life now and where we fit into life, you and I and all of the beautiful souls that God has created, even those souls who have not yet realized their beauty, who have not yet realized their spiritual nature, that each and every one of us, that we are on a journey, a pathway, and a different pathway perhaps for each one of us. But we are in the process of awakening, in the process of becoming aware of our spiritual nature, in the process of discovering the unity with all of life and the unity with God that already exists. And what we are doing is we are shedding millions and perhaps billions of years of race consciousness, of human consciousness, of telling us that we are only material, that we are only matter, that somehow matter organized itself into a brain, and the brain created this phenomenon of consciousness, as opposed to the spiritual view, which is that consciousness called the matter into form. This is what Genesis is all about. Consciousness called the matter into form to express its own life in some unique way. So as we begin to awaken, the most important thing that we must have, the most important ingredient, if you will, in our spiritual awakening is desire. If we do not desire to know God more fully, more completely in our lives every day, then we won't. There are lots and lots of things that we can put our attention on at any time and in any place. There's more things than we can put our attention on than we're even aware of. They tell us that there's so much more going on about us that we don't even perceive, because our minds or our consciousness can only take in a small part at a time. You've seen this. You've seen these kind of examples on TV where they stage a crime to have a purse snatcher come into the TV studio and run up on the stage and take a purse and then leave. And then the audience is asked to describe this person. And there's the descriptions that are given vary from all over the place. Because even though everybody was in the same room and the same thing happened in front of them, everything that they believed about it was filtered by their consciousness. So we live in a world where there's much more to take in than we seem to be capable of doing at this time. And what comes in is what we focus on, what we give our attention to. So in many regards, what we expect to see is what we see. So in order to kind of move ourselves out of the distractions, we have our spiritual practices. And the greatest of all is to awaken within ourselves, to fan the flame of the desire to know God more deeply into an inferno. Rumi says it in poetry because it is ineffable. It goes beyond words. Rumi puts it in poetry that it's like the moth going to the flame, and it will beat its head against the glass over the candle until one night the person leaves the glass off the candle, and at that moment the moth just flies into the flame to be consumed by it for that moment of bliss. That moment of bliss of experiencing the unity with the flame. In the East, they tell us not to bother going to seek God unless we are seeking as earnestly as we would be looking for a pond if our hair was on fire. And that's what we're talking about this month, of ways of awakening within ourselves to help ourselves to become more aware every moment of every day, even while we're asleep, even in our dreams, every moment of every day, of the immediate presence of the divine, of the goodness of God, of the power of God, as a palpable, tangible presence in our lives. So we start to have this desire to as the song in Godspell says, to know thee more clearly, to love thee more dearly, to follow thee more nearly. We start to have this stirring of our soul to know God, to experience God more fully. And we come to realize that in biblical terms, we're told if you're on your way to the temple to give your gifts to God, and you remember that you have something against your brother, lay your gifts down by the side of the road and go make peace with your brother. Right? If you have something that you need to forgive, if you have a resentment that you're holding on, you have to let go of that. You have to let go of that because it keeps you from that which you desire, the experience of God. So as we go through that process of letting go, of letting go of that crust that has been kind of keeping that magnificence at bay within us, that shell, that we're waiting for the chicken to hatch through. Now that we have acknowledged our desire, now that we have acknowledged our desire to know God, our desire to let go of everything in our lives that we have allowed to hold us back, now we are kind of open. Now we are kind of open to experience the spiritual practice of gratitude. Now, as I said in the email, for those who read the email last night, our language is a funny thing. Excuse me. We kind of learn it, without studying it. We learn it as children. We hear those around us speaking, and we kind of assign meanings to words based on the way that they're used, the context in which they're used. And of course, the way that our parents used the word may not have been entirely correct. If you go back and try to read a book that was written 150 years ago, sometimes it's hard. Emerson is hard for me to read because the way that he used words is much different than the meaning of the words when I grew up with them. So we kind of learn a meaning for a word out of the context that we first experience it and first encounter it in when we're children. And we tend to go through life thinking, well, that's what that word means. And of course, it's not the only meaning of the word. Every word has multiple meanings. This is why studying Scripture and people telling you this is what the Bible said and this is what the Bible means is a very risky business, because in the language that Jesus spoke in the New Testament, there was only 4,000 words, and every word had multiple meanings. And you had to understand the context of the culture in order to properly discern what that word meant at that time. For example, the word run. If I just said to you, what does run mean? Well, it means lots of things. Run could mean to move rapidly on your feet, like a marathon racer. Run could mean that you're in a contest for a political office. Run could mean that you're in charge of something, like you run the organization, or run could be that you operate a machine, or that you've launched a program on a computer. I'm running a spreadsheet on my computer, things like that. So the word itself has many different meanings, and the way that we come to figure out which meaning applies in a particular situation is we have to listen the context. We have to understand the context. Now, the problem that we have, of course, is that many times, if you're like me, maybe you're not. Maybe you're a lot smarter than I am. But sometimes I would get a meaning to a word stuck in my head, and I would think, well, this is what the word means, and I would go through life and think that that's what other people meant by it. And then somewhere in the course of my experience, I would say, well, that doesn't quite fit. That doesn't make sense to me. And of course, in my human arrogance, I would say they're wrong. They use that word incorrectly. I don't know if you remember the movie The Princess Bride. Where the guy kept using the word inconceivable, and finally the other character says, "You keep using that word, but I don't think it means what you think it means." And we have words that are like that. So something happens. There's a cognitive dissonance, I guess. It just doesn't fit. It doesn't feel right. And it sends us to the dictionary. We go to the dictionary, we look up the meaning of the word, we go, oh, I see. So that word can mean something else than the only definition that I knew that it meant. And here, this meaning down here, within the context that this other person was using it, now it makes sense to me. But it has a totally different meaning of what I learned the first time I heard it as a child. Now, I say that because gratitude is one of those words. I'm going to hold up a little book here for people on YouTube. This is a book that I got from Hay House, from Louise Hay, and it's called Gratitude, A Way of Life, and it's by Louise Hay and friends. And what it is a series of little one-page essays, I don't know, maybe between 50 and 100 different essays by different authors on some aspect of gratitude. two or three pages each essay is all that's in there. And I love to break it out at this time of the year and start to go through and pick out the names of the people that I know in there, some of the ministers that I have met at conferences, some of the personalities like Wayne Dyer and folks like that have written articles for it. And I love to go through and kind of read and try to extract from what they're writing, what do they mean by gratitude? What do they mean by gratitude? Because gratitude is one of those things that everybody uses the word, but everybody may have a different definition. It's like love or God. What do they mean? What do we mean by gratitude? And I think it's important that we kind of come up with our own definition, each one of us. I'm going to share some ideas that are my ideas, some ideas that I have read from other authors. But clearly each one of us needs to understand, well, what do I mean? What do I mean when I use that word? What do I mean when I say that word? We're into a month of gratitude. We're into a month of Thanksgiving. You're probably seeing posts on Facebook where people are, every day they post something that they give thanks for. So the whole society seems to be kind of mulling around this idea of what is Thanksgiving and what is gratitude. And each one of us, we must come to an understanding for ourselves. What does it mean? So I want to kind of go through a couple of different contexts, a couple of different worldviews, if you will. You've heard me talk about these before, levels 1, 2, and 3. The evolution of human consciousness, as human consciousness matures, it goes through certain levels. And it has to go through each level, and it has to develop certain competencies at each level before it can move to the next and stay in the next level. And that's kind of an interesting thing about human beings. We all want to go right to the top, but we don't have what it takes to stay at the top. So we come sliding back down, kind of like Chutes and Ladders, the little game for the children. So we have to develop the appropriate competencies as we go through each level before we're really capable of moving forward. But each level has its own unique worldview. It has its own orientation. And within that orientation, it has different meanings for the word gratitude. And when you read a book like the one that I held up, or you listen to people talk about gratitude, you have to ask yourself, where are they coming from? What is their orientation? What is their worldview? Because depending upon where they're coming from, it kind of gives you a feel for their meaning. So the first worldview that we talk about is kind of the one that we have and we develop as children. And it doesn't mean that it's only children that have that. I want to make sure that I don't let anybody fall into a trap that says, well, I'm 40 years old, so that doesn't apply to me. It could very well apply to people who are 100 years old. But it's kind of the first level of organized consciousness that we come to. And in that level of organized consciousness, all of the power is out there somewhere, whether it be our parents, our teachers, our clergy, the police, or our God. Everything is out there somewhere. All of the power is out there. All of the money is out there. All of the resources is out there. And what we have to do as children, what we have to do in order to survive is we have to learn what behavior we must engage in that is pleasing to the people who have whatever it is that we want in order to entice them to give it to us. This is a level of consciousness where we are either a victim or a victor. Excuse me, I'm going to get a drink of water here. We have nothing, we have to figure out how to get something, take it, or get people to give it to us. And if we have a lot of stuff, then we have to hold on to it, see? We have to keep it. That is, this level of consciousness is epitomized by the bumper sticker that says, "He who dies with the most toys wins." Now, in that level of consciousness, gratitude is kind of a response, a reaction or a response. It is a politeness. Somebody gives you something and you say thank you. You know, the children come to the door and say trick or treat. We put candy in their bag and they all kind of cheer out thank you in their little kid voices. And we're taught this, you know, as we're growing up. If somebody does something for you, somebody does something to you, something that is nice, you need to express gratitude. And here the definition of gratitude that you get when you look in the dictionary is gratitude is a willingness to express appreciation. That is gratitude at that level of consciousness, a willingness to express appreciation, an acknowledgement that somebody out there did something for us over here, and we are grateful for it. And again, I don't know exactly what grateful means other than at that level, other than that we're saying thank you. There's another definition that kind of works at that level that says it is an emotional response to somebody doing something nice for us. You know, so somebody does something, and we feel something. We feel an emotion. We feel some type of response, and that emotion is referred to as gratitude. And of course, that's a very, very vague description, because there's no guarantee that what I feel when somebody does something is the same as what you feel when somebody does something. We may feel entirely different things, and yet we're trying to put a label on it. We're trying to put a meaning on it and say, well, that's gratitude. But the idea that we want to keep in mind at that level of consciousness is that gratitude is a reaction or a response to something that someone or some power outside of us has done for us. And in some cases, you know, it is perhaps a form of manipulation. And I've even heard ministers, not of our denomination, but I've heard ministers who have preached sermons to the effect of, well, if you don't thank God for what you already have, well, why would God give you more? Why would God give you more? So in that light, what we're saying then is that expressing gratitude to other people and expressing gratitude to God is not only a polite response, you know, kind of an obsequious response, oh, well, thank you, you know, response kind of automatically that we put in, but it is a way that we are trying to ensure we get more stuff, right? So if you give me something and I don't thank you for it, why would you give me more stuff? If God gives me life and I don't thank God for it, well, why would God give me more life? That is the way that level one thinks. That is the way of thinking. What do I have to do? What behavior do I have to engage in order for those who have what I want to give it to me? Even in religious terms, even the idea of tithing, you know, the idea of tithing started, well, we'll give, you know, the first 10% of everything that we have goes back to God through the temple, goes back to God. An acknowledgement that everything that we have comes from God. And then later on it became convoluted. It became, well, gee, if I want $1,000, if I give 10% of that, if I give $100 to my temple or to my church, well, then God is going to bless me tenfold and give me $1,000. And people were looking at it as a business investment, you know, and totally lost the spiritual intent, which is, can we acknowledge God as the source and the substance of all of our life in everything that we have? And can we freely give of what we have to those places where we see God's love in action? Because we know that we are not the creator of the good. We are not the creator of the substance. It is the invisible supply coming into form, and there's more than enough of that. Do we trust that? Do we believe that? So I don't know if you remember, Drew Carey used to have a sitcom, and there was a character in a Drew Carey show. I think it might have been Oswald. I'm not certain. But every once in a while, he would state something blatantly obvious, and then he would realize it was true, and he'd go, "Hey, wait a minute." You know, kind of like it was a revelation to him, you know, like we're watching TV, and it seems like the people who have the TV shows on, all they want to do is get us to watch commercials, you know. Hey, wait a minute, So at some point, what happens to us in our spiritual growth as we start to think about what's going on at level one, we say, no, wait a minute, gratitude. We have to express our gratitude to God so God will give us more stuff. And if we don't express our gratitude to God, God's going to withhold from us. Wait a minute, does that make any sense? Does that make any sense at all? Is that superstition? Is that a superstitious way of thinking? If we don't offer God a dove or a goat or a bushel of grain, that somehow God is going to make us sick or punish us? What kind of a God are we believing in? So we come to the realization that gratitude doesn't do anything to God or for God, or couldn't move God in one way or the other. How could the omnipotence and the omniscience of the universe, how could it need our thanks? How could it need our gratitude? How could it need us to stop and acknowledge it? It's kind of a fragile God, no? A God that would get angry because of something that its creation did or didn't do? A God that needs to hear that which has created tell it how wonderful it is? And we start to think about that and say, well, this doesn't make sense. This just doesn't compute, as the computer in Star Trek used to say. So maybe this idea of what God is and what I am, maybe it's time for us to awaken to a different idea, and maybe it's time for us to kind of explore different ideas about gratitude. What is gratitude? Now, gratitude is an art. It's not a science. In Science of Mind, Dr. Holmes gave us a template for prayer, a 5-step template for prayer, a scientific method he called, because it was repeatable. It was a repeatable method, a method that we can start and work with and experiment with. And his idea is anybody who takes that template and starts to use it will have results. But when it comes to gratitude, there's no template. How do you do gratitude? What is it we don't know? It's something. It's a feeling. Perhaps it's an emotion. Perhaps. But is it something that we can do with a template? How do we do it? How do we practice gratitude? And of course, we're told, well, at night before you go to sleep, you can sit down and you can count your blessings. I remember being told that as a child. I certainly was. Count your blessings before you go to sleep at night. And of course, we were immediately told, and then remember all the bad things you did during the day and ask for forgiveness. But count your blessings. That's one way that we can do something tangible, something repeatable. I can tell you to count your blessings. But when we start to get into this second level of consciousness, at the second level of consciousness, then what happens is, instead of all of the power being out there, we start to realize that at least some of the power is here within us. And that our life is not so much dependent upon the whims of some outside power and our ability to manipulate it, to get it to do what we want to do, to pray incessantly to try to annoy God into giving us what we want. But we start to realize that life is done unto us according to what we believe, right? We start to move out of the level one phase of I call it fundamentalism or orthodoxy, of believing that everything is a result of behavior. And now we start to move into a belief that everything is a result of consciousness. Right? Even our behavior is a result of our consciousness. So we start to realize that as we begin to change our consciousness, as what we think and believe changes, our experience changes. We start to recognize that the locus of control, where the control is not so much out there as it is at least partially in here. At level 2, we believe it's at least partially in here. And that we have some responsibility and some accountability for what we believe, for choosing what we will believe. We start to come to an understanding that it is done unto us according to our belief. And we start to wonder, well, how do I know what I believe? And how do I change what I believe? And then the importance of gratitude as a spiritual practice to help us to change our belief, it becomes apparent to us. We become aware of that. So rather than just saying thank you out of some emotional stirring or some sense of politeness, now we're starting to look towards gratitude as a means of helping us to become more aware and to change our belief. Now, mind you, when we were at level 1, we might have been engaging in gratitude as a way of getting more stuff, and we carry that motivation with us into level 2. And a lot of times in level 2, we're trying to figure out how the universe works, how God works, and how can we work with it to get what we want. It's not a bad thing. Dr. Holmes tells us it's not a bad thing. It's a natural thing that we do that, but eventually we move out of that. Eventually we move out of the desire to get stuff, whether it be health or wealth or love or better job and all those things, and we start to move into the ultimate desire, which is simply to be with God, to know God, to be at home with the beloved, I think is the way that Dr. Holmes put it. That becomes our only goal, or as I think it was Augustine or Aquinas put it, I ask nothing of thee, not even thy love. I only want thee. We only want to be with God. But at this level 2, then you start to hear things like, well, gratitude is a spiritual practice. Gratitude is awareness, and gratitude is a way of life, and gratitude is causative energy. And the last one comes from Eric Butterworth in his book, Spiritual Economics. Gratitude is causative energy. Florence Scovel Shinn said life is a game of boomerangs. What you give out, you get back. The Bible tells us you cast your bread upon the waters, and they return unto you. In the New Testament, in the Old Testament, it says your word shall not return unto you void. And we start to understand that there's a power in the universe, the law of mind, we call it. There's a power in the universe that responds to us according to our belief. And then working through that belief, it creates the circumstances in our life that are the perfect outpicturing of our mental equivalent. So if we believe that we live in a kind and loving universe, if we believe that we are already provided for enough and plenty, if we believe that the intelligence that has created us out of itself and has created our very bodies out of the dust of the earth, if we believe that it cares for us and it is provided for us and we are receiving that good, excuse me, then we shall receive that. If we believe that we are victims and that we must work hard and we must eat our bread by the sweat of our brow, and we have to be street smart and clever, and we have to figure out how to keep people from cheating us and stealing us all the time, and perhaps we need to cheat and steal from them just to keep up, well then that's the experience we will have. That is a level 1 experience. So as we get into level 2, this practice of gratitude now takes on a different context for us. It takes on a different meaning. Rather than trying to satisfy those in the power above us, what we are really trying to do is we are trying to find ways to expand our conscious awareness of the presence and the activity of God about us. We listen to things like when Jesus told the disciples who were asking him, this very tough question, the same one that we ask ourselves, how do we go about being spiritual beings in a world that requires us to work? We being the fishermen who are following Jesus, we have boats to take care of, we have nets to mend, we have families to feed. We don't have time to just go traipsing all around the countryside following you, exploring these philosophical ideas of spirituality. And the response that Jesus gave to them was that the gifts have already been given. Think of the birds of the air, the lilies of the field. They're taken care of. They don't have to work hard. They don't have to sow. They don't have to toil. But what they need has already been provided. And how much more so have you been provided for? You, a conscious expression of the divine. You, a soul, a place where the divine has come into expression in this world as you. Now, none of us are completely aware of us, and none of us completely behave that way, and none of us are God, right? None of us, as I said, none of us are all that God is. But whatever we are is some part of the divine. So now we come into this practice of gratitude as a way of consciously reminding ourselves that we are already connected to the goodness of God. We are already in the flow of God's life. None of us knows how to take a breath and squeeze the oxygen out of the air and push it into our blood. We don't know how to do that. If I told you, consciously do something to make that happen, you wouldn't know what to do. If I told you to stop making it happen, you wouldn't know what to do. We don't know how to do that. We don't know how to cause our hearts to beat. We don't know how to take the very food that we eat and turn it into the muscle and the bone that our body needs. But there is that intelligence within us that already knows. And what gratitude then becomes at this level, the second level, this gratitude then becomes a way of causing ourselves deliberately to be consciously aware that we are in the flow. And as we do so, because as Eric Butterworth tells us, gratitude is a causative energy. As we do so, then what happens is we will experience more and more and more of that flow. And as I said earlier, at the beginning of our entry into level 2, we think, isn't this great? Isn't this great? I get more stuff. I can have more money. I can have more cars. I can have more houses. I can have more stuff. And once we realize that everything has been provided, then our desire to demonstrate more stuff diminishes. And we truly come to the understanding that, wait a second, the only reason that any of this is working is literally I and the Father are one. It is literally because the activity and the presence of God are here and are now and are making themselves visible in my life. So the way that we practice gratitude in this second level, and the second level is probably where most of us in the teaching are. The second level is we're trying to learn, we're trying to understand who is God, what is God, excuse me, who am I, what am I, how does this life work, where did I come from, where do I go to? All of these deep, deep questions are what is pushing us forward, and this desire to know God. It is pushing us forward. So now what we do in our practice is we look on everything that we see, even the ordinary things that we see, the things that we take for granted, and we find a way to get ourselves to pause and to acknowledge that this is the activity and the blessing of God in my very life, right where I am, here and now. And we're not doing it out of a sense of politeness or obligation. We're not doing it out of a sense of superstition or fear that if we don't do it, that somehow we're going to offend God. So gratitude doesn't do anything to God. It does everything to us. And eventually we get to the point where we're not doing it just for the sake of seeing an increase in our lives. Although there's nothing wrong with that, it's good. Dr. Holmes tells us if you need money to pay the rent, then certainly you do your treatment for the money to pay the rent. But at some point we want to move forward into the only thing that we wish to experience is the love of God itself, the experience of oneness with God. So when we say that gratitude is a spiritual practice, it is, because it reminds us of our spiritual origins. It reminds us of the presence and the activity of God. When we say that gratitude is awareness, that is also kind of a level 2 definition where we say, yes, we are aware of the presence and the activity of God. We're aware of the miracle in the leaves as they change color, and the miracle of every breath we take, every drink of water, every bite of food, every beat of our heart, every child that is born, every person that dies are all part of this miracle of life. And we wish to see the goodness in this circle of life, in this flow of life, that everything that God made is good, including us. And I think for many people that's the hard part, to go stand in front of the mirror and look in the mirror and remind ourselves that everything God made is good, including us. So gratitude kind of evolves then from kind of a polite and a superstitious thank you to an awareness, to a way of life, to a causative energy, to a realization of our oneness with life. You know, I'm absolutely amazed. I know I've told you this example before, this story before, but it just demonstrates to me how the love of God provides. You know, the Arctic terns, I guess during the summer months in the northern hemisphere, they live somewhere up in the Arctic. But when it gets to be winter up there, they migrate, and they go all the way down to somewhere down to South America, thousands and thousands of miles from their home in the Arctic. And at some point during the spring or early summer in the northern hemisphere, at some point something within them tells them it's time to go back. It's probably related to the phases of the moon and the angle of the sun over the horizon and all of these other things that the animals have learned to cue in on. But at some point they know it's time to go. However they know, you know, I mean, not like you and I have a big aha moment, but something within them stirs them and they move. Excuse me again. They move. And it's too far for them to fly in one flight. So they fly about 4,000 miles and they land in the Chesapeake Bay. And that's where they stop to rest and to feed. And they arrive in Chesapeake Bay at the exact time that their food supply is hatching. They live off of the small horseshoe crabs that hatch. Here's God's view of supply and demand. And of course the exchange makes each species stronger. Both of them get stronger, right? The terns get the energy that they need to continue the flight. The horseshoe crab population through the process of natural selection gets stronger. And if we could look at that and recognize that we are one with that, we are part of that includes us, you see. The same intelligence that cares for those birds and those horseshoe crabs, it cares for us. Then we would start to advance our growth. So our spiritual practice of gratitude when we are in the second level, the level of being a student, the level of learning, the level of trying to know and to understand, what it brings us to is to that third level, the mystical level, the level of the experience of oneness, the actual experience of the presence of God. And what I would like to suggest to you today is that at that level, gratitude is simply a sense of belonging, a sense of being, a sense of isness, for lack of a better word. I ask you to consider, is God grateful? And I would think that the answer to that is no. What does God have to be grateful for? It is aware. It has all that it needs. It can do all that it wants. But this idea of emotionally responding to itself for something it did is foreign. Doesn't make any sense. This idea of it having to do something to consciously remind itself of its own beingness, of its own oneness, of its own self-givingness, that's also foreign. Why would it have to do that for itself? You and I don't get up in the morning and think to ourselves, is gravity working? We take it for granted gravity is working. Why would the divine mind have to stop and remind itself that it is giving and receiving, both at the same time? I don't think it would. I think that it is just aware of its beingness. So I think that the practice of gratitude and the purpose of gratitude and all of our spiritual practices are to bring ourselves through our humanness, to break ourselves out of the crust of race consciousness, to let go of the old ideas and the old definitions that no longer work because we are moving to a different context, to a different place in our spiritual growth. And to finally get ourselves into the ineffable, into that place where the body, the actions, the doing have fallen off. The logic and rationalization of the mind has fallen off. And we simply are. We simply are one with the presence of the divine, and we know that we belong there. We know that we are good enough. We must be, because God made us. As the t-shirts we had for the children say, and God don't make no junk. As we move forward this month, as we continue to explore ideas of gratitude as spiritual practice, what gratitude is in our life, what is thanksgiving, I ask you to consider that what we are doing is that we are consciously forcing an awareness of our connection to the divine. And we are doing so to get to the point where we no longer have to consciously force our awareness. We are just aware. We just belong. God is all that there is, and that includes us. It includes me. And we can do so with the sense of the ego being gone. The ego, the I, the little I, the one that we think we are. The I that gets offended. The I that thinks it has to win. The I that thinks it has to collect stuff is gone. And the true demonstration of the experience of I of my own self do nothing. But it is the spirit within that does it all. It is a surrender. It is a surrender to that presence, to that love, to that beingness. And gratitude is an important practice along the way. You are the love of God. We are truly grateful that you are in our lives. We recognize you as the love and the presence. And so it is.